Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to this workshop. We are at Revival Through Righteousness, God's Heart for the Stranger. I have the privilege of introducing our speaker today, Matt Brevere. Matt resides in Canton, Ohio, and is a Malone College graduate. He is a ministry consultant serving the Great Lakes region with the National Association of Evangelicals. In his role, he works to support and equip church leaders and ministries across the region, bringing insight from his work at the intersection of faith and community engagement. Prior to serving as a ministry consultant, Matt was an assistant professor of practical theology for 2 decades at Ashland Theological Seminary, and he also holds a doctor of ministry from Ashland Theological Seminary as well. So join me as we welcome Matt Brevere.
Thank you very much. So it's great to be with you today. I was here with you last year, so it's good to be invited back. And appreciate the chance. I even though I'm not evangelical friends, I always have a warm place in my heart for the evangelical friends, being a Malone graduate. When I started at Malone as a young freshman, if someone would have suggested to me that I would have become a pastor, I would have laughed at the thought. And 4 years later, when I was graduating, I was a candidate for ordination in the United Methodist Church. So, never tell God no, and never say never. So I always appreciated my connection to Malone. It was such a formative place for me. It was where I discovered my call to ministry. So I'm glad to be here with you. So today we want to talk about God's heart for the stranger. To begin that conversation, we need to learn to operate this thing. So to begin that conversation, I want to talk about the current landscape of what's happening in immigration as we as a nation engage with people who are here that we would call strangers in many ways. Some of you have probably heard the phrase that comes out of some of the work from missiologists, exegeting your community. And if you went to seminary, you know all about exegesis, drawing out of the scripture what's in there so that we can make interpretations of that scripture with practical application for today. And so we need to kind of understand the community around us and what is happening with those folks who are immigrants so that we know how, as the community of faith, to respond to their experience. And so I do want to talk about current immigration policy and the impact particularly on families and children, and then we'll end with just some thoughts about God's heart for the stranger, and I'm sure we'll have time for discussion. So I am, as you heard, Matt Brevere. I am a ministry consultant for the National Association of Evangelicals. I do most of my work in education and advocacy on behalf of immigrants. That's where I spend most of my time, although we do engage in other issues as well. So this is basically what I want to talk about today. I want to first talk about NAE's position on immigration. I think it's very important that people understand where we come from as an organization on this topic. Because as you know, this topic is fraught with conflict, misunderstanding, arguments, and a lot of emotional engagement that sometimes prevents us from having meaningful conversations even in the church and moving this forward. And so I'd like to talk to you a little, just very briefly, about our position on immigration. I'd like to talk about risks to families and children and just briefly give you 2 documents that NAE has published in the last year on this topic. And I want to talk about the immigration policy drivers and how they affect families and children and the risks that they face today. And then talk about a couple of immediate concerns and how we can respond as Christians. And then again, let's have some discussion and some questions. So our position on immigration, I want to say first that our position on immigration is a balanced position. It's not always characterized as that. As you know, sometimes, given this conversation, you can argue for a position and people will then take that and take it to what they think is a logical conclusion and make it sound different than what it really is. So here are 6 points that we make about immigration and our understanding of what we would like to see transpire. The first thing we want to say is we do want to strengthen the rule of law when it comes to immigration. Now that means for us both strengthening the rule of law around immigrants that come here, but not only simply the immigrants that come here, we also want to strengthen the rule of law around the way immigrants are treated and to make sure that they are given things like due process. So for us, that's a two-way street, and it's very important to state that up front. We do want to see an implementation of secure, humane borders. We do believe that citizens have the right in any country to expect that their government knows who's coming in, right? And are their intentions good, or are they intending ill? And so the expectation that many of us Christians have, in fact, I think most Christians have, that's a very reasonable expectation, and we support that. We would like to see not only the implementation of secure and humane borders for both not only the benefit of American citizens, but also for those who want to come here. We also want to see a streamlined and expanded process for asylum seekers who are coming here to create better lives for their families. And the reality of the situation is our immigration system is severely dysfunctional. And what we have with most of the immigrants who come here is they are caught up in a very dysfunctional system that has become impossible for them to navigate. We'll talk a little bit about that. We do believe that restitution should be required of those who have violated the law who come here. There are people who come here who, we hear a lot about they should do it the right way, right? I will tell you the problem with that phrase is that right now there is no right way for immigrants to come here. There are a lot of folks who come here and they mistakenly think that if they just work hard and do the right thing, obey the law, and fill out whatever paperwork they need to, that they will be able to be legal here in the United States. And that is just not true. The system is severely dysfunctional. And so we would like to see a streamlined, a process that makes sense, that's easy to understand, and one that can expand the opportunities for people who want to come here. And again, require restitution for those who have violated the law. We would like to see a streamlined pathway to citizenship for those who qualify, like DACA recipients. And I'm sure most of you know that DACA is deferred action for child arrivals, those children who were brought here under the age of 2, who are not U.S. citizens because they were not born here, and they're kind of in limbo in terms of their status. And so these children should not be punished, and we believe that they should be provided with a streamlined process, which, by the way, most Americans agree with. And finally, maintain due process for all immigrants. Due process in the United States, affirmed by the Supreme Court, is not just for those who are citizens, but non-citizens who reside in the U.S., even undocumented people who reside in the U.S., are constitutionally covered by due process, and we want to see that maintained and strengthened. Okay, there are 2 reports that we have published on immigration and impact on families and children, and I want to just mention those to you. You can find them very easily on our website, and you can download them in PDF format. The first one, this is the first one that we published back in 2025, called One Part of the Body, the Potential Impact of Deportations on American Christian Families. We published this along with World Relief, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and the Center for the Study of Global Christianity, which is centered at Gordon Conwell Seminary. The second report that we just published, I think it was in May, is called Joined Together, Torn Apart, How U.S. Immigration Policies Are Separating Families. And this we co-authored with World Relief, which is our humanitarian arm. If you know World Relief, World Relief was started in World War II as a way of help managing the refugees crisis that was taking place in Europe at the time. Immigration policies directly affect families. And one of the things about the NAE is we say very decisively that we are a pro-life institution from the beginning of life to its natural end, or womb to tomb, as people like to say. And we believe that families are essential in holding a truly pro-life view, and that families should not be separated. And so one of the reasons that we published these two documents was to raise awareness among Christians about what is happening and the potential that could happen to immigrant families because of current immigration policy. So put simply, current and proposed U.S. immigration enforcement policies, especially large-scale deportation campaigns, would separate more than 1 million American families, including hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizen children and spouses, many of whom are a part of Christian congregations. There are currently 10 million Christian immigrants in the United States who are part of the church in the U.S. 1 in 18 evangelicals are immigrants. So think about the size of the auditorium when you all gather and how many people are in there. If that were to represent the evangelical church across the country, 1 in every 18 people would be an immigrant. Projected impact by 2029. This comes from the 2026 report, and one thing I want you to notice about this is that these are estimated projections by 2029. These figures do not represent the totality of the numbers. If current policies continue, if the objectives of the current administration, if they're able to enact those, 910,000 U.S. citizen children would lose one or both of their parents to deportation. 665 children would lose both of their parents because they're both undocumented. 272,000 U.S. citizen spouses will be separated from their husband or wife. 150,000 spouses and children will remain stuck abroad, unable to reunite. So think of the father who was deported and they cannot get back to their wife and their children. They're not allowed back in the country, and so there's this separation. The total affected by 2029 would be 1.3 million people. Now, if you think about that number, that is greater than the population of 8 states in the United States. And by that, I don't mean the totality of population in those 8 states. I mean that 1.3 million people is more than the population of each of those 8 states. So that kind of puts in perspective how many people we're talking about here. Specific impact on Christian families. 1 in 12 Christians in the U.S. is vulnerable to deportation or lives in a mixed status family. So let me say something about mixed status families. A mixed status family, by definition, is a family unit in which at least one member is a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident, that would be a green card holder, and at least one other member has a different immigration status. Now that could be a whole host of different statuses. They could be undocumented. They could be a DACA recipient. They could be under temporary protected status, which we hear a lot of today because of the Haitians and what they're going through. That could be folks who are on humanitarian parole, and that's different than TPS. Humanitarian parole is basically more individualized, where TPS covers a whole group of people, say maybe because there's violence in their country. Humanitarian parole covers individuals who have made their case that they really can't go back to their home country because of the threat of violence or death, and so they're given humanitarian parole. People who are on non-immigrant visas, not people who are not planning on staying here permanently, but are here for a specific task, usually, say work, for example. Maybe they have a pending asylum case, pending green card application. The idea the thing that I want you to think about is that family legal protections or that the family's legal protections and vulnerabilities are not the same across members of the family. So when I say that 1 in 12 Christians in the U.S. is vulnerable to deportation in mixed status families, there are a whole range of things that could bring them under threat. And we no longer are in a situation where we only worry about the undocumented, because we see, for example, people who have had legal status having that revoked. And so now those folks can possibly be deported. 4 out of 5 immigrants vulnerable to deportation are Christians. They are Catholic, Protestant, or come from some other Christian tradition. Deportations would disproportionately affect church members, ministry leaders, and volunteers and families that are deeply integrated within the congregational life. So one of the questions, so while at the NAE we're very clear that we don't think one's religious affiliation should affect their status in the United States, right? That is not a criteria for whether or not you should be here or not be here. But certainly as the people of God, we need to wrestle with the fact that 4 out of 5 immigrants vulnerable to deportation are brothers and sisters in Christ. And what does that mean for us as the people of God? There it goes. According to Pew Research in their 2023-2024 religious landscape study, immigrants in the U.S. by religious affiliation are as follows. 58% of immigrants coming to the United States are Christians. 30% are Catholic, 15% are evangelical Protestant, 5% are mainline Protestant, 4% are historically Black Protestant, 2% Orthodox, and other Christians are roughly 1%. Other religions, 14% religiously unaffiliated, 26%. The Pew 2024 global study estimates that the religious identity of the world, so Pew estimates there are 280 million international migrants right now, 280 million. And that is projected to increase, by the way. That is not a number that is going down. So the United States and the world has to wrestle with the immigration issue because it's an issue that is going to increase. Of those 280 million international migrants, 47%, nearly half of all of those are Christians. 47%. 29% are Muslim, and they actually have a higher share of the global population of migrants to Muslims, simply because of all of the political unrest that's going on in Muslim countries right now. 47% are Christians. So, who's vulnerable, given current immigration policy? Long-term undocumented residents, often that have been here between 15 and 25 years. These are folks who have jobs, own businesses, with employees, have families, children, grandchildren. These are pastors. I can't tell you how many immigrants are pastors in our churches and are under the threat of deportation and have been deported. Parents of U.S. citizen children, over 4 million children live with deportable parents. Spouses of U.S. children, 1.2 million mixed status marriages. And who else is vulnerable? Individuals with, and I want you to notice of how many of these are people who are here with legal status, temporary protected status, deferred action for childhood arrivals, humanitarian parole, deferred enforced departure, pending asylum claims. All these people are here legally, and yet they're under threat of deportation. And we'll talk about why that is. Many of these folks have passed background checks, paid taxes, and contributed to churches and local economies for decades. And right now they're under threat of deportation. Children, of course, are the ones who bear the brunt of deportation efforts. The average age of affected children is 8 years old. I can tell you stories of, I'm in touch a lot with immigrant communities in Cleveland, and I can tell you stories of children who came home from school only to find that their parents were not there, that they were gone, and they had no idea what they were. 71% of separated children, as you can imagine, would fall into poverty. Many face trauma, instability, and impossible choices. And some of these choices obviously are not their own. They're not their own if they're underage. Do they remain in the U.S. without parents, or do they move to dangerous countries with their parents that they have never known? Right? And how do parents make those kinds of decisions? Do we take our children with us into a country where there's all kinds of gang violence, or do we leave them with a relative or a good friend and know that they'll be relatively safe here in the U.S.? About 2.7 million U.S. citizen children are at risk of being left with no parents. These kids are whose only co-resident parents are undocumented, so they don't have, say, a parent who's a citizen that they can stay with. But these are children whose both parents can be deported. The number of these children that become orphans in the U.S. is very high, unless someone steps in and unless they are given foster care. And there are people who do this. There are organizations that this is their job, to help give foster care to children who are left when their parents are deported. In February of 25, the administration ordered nonprofit legal services providers to halt work under a federal contract that funded attorneys for unaccompanied children. So when a child is here without parents, if they come unaccompanied or for one reason or another they're separated from their parents, they still have to go to court because even children are due their day in court. And we used to have a fund that would provide attorneys for them in court. That fund in February 2025 was suspended. Now, it doesn't mean that they can't have an attorney with them in court. It just means the government will no longer pay for them to have an attorney in court. And so many of these children are in front of a judge who has to walk them through what's happening as best that judge can. And they have no legal representation with them. I want you to think about that for a minute. They have no legal representation. When that happened in February, 26,000 children lost access to government-funded legal care. 26,000 children. Now, there is a bill before Congress called the Fair Day in Court for Kids Act. And if it's passed, it will restore and guarantee legal representation for unaccompanied children. But that bill, which passed, it was presented in June, but it has not yet moved through the process. And with as slow as Congress moves, who knows how long that's going to take. So right now, these children, there are organizations that are offering legal help for these children, but I can tell you that the legal system for immigration right now is so overwhelmed that they can't keep up with the demand. Spouses. Mixed status marriages often involve couples married, as I'm sure you know, over 10 years. And so deportation forces what we call widow-like or orphan-like situations for U.S. citizens. And spouses have to choose. Do I stay in the U.S. with my children? If I've got teenage children, they were born here, they're citizens, they've been in school, they have friends. Maybe they're most likely bilingual, but maybe English is their primary language because that's the language they use in school. What do I do? Do I take my children so that we can stay together as a family? Do we depend if we're going back to Haiti? This is a real problem in terms of their safety. So what do I do? Imagine being in this situation as a spouse. It's a very difficult one. So policy drivers of this situation, I want to go through that a little bit. The mass deportation goals of the current administration are up to 1 million per year. And in order to achieve that number, not only have they focused on undocumented immigrants, but also termination of programs that allow people to be here legally. So termination of DACA, termination of temporary protected status, humanitarian parole, other temporary protections, the visa process, which people can apply for to come here legally. There have been freezes or bans put into place, and indiscriminate enforcement, including parents with no criminal history. When this administration first started, they said they were going to pursue the worst of the worst. And the reality is 95% of people who are detained for immigration violations have no criminal convictions whatsoever. There's no way that we could get to 1 million every year by simply pursuing the worst of the worst. They pursued long-term residents and those with pending legal cases who are in the system, their cases are pending, they're under review, and yet they are targeted for deportation. When it comes to DACA, DACA is still active for current recipients. They continue to process renewals nationwide per court order, but the new applications have been frozen. So there isn't anybody who would fit into that category who can now apply for DACA. And this remains true even in Texas. Texas is right now in court trying to terminate DACA recipients' right to legally work here. So imagine somebody who they've been here since they were 2 years old, they're now 25 or whatever the age would be, they're working in a meaningful job, maybe they're a nurse, and if they're in Texas, Texas wants to be able to revoke the work permit of that person, so they can no longer work in Texas, which would obviously force them to go to another state or to leave the country. TPS, temporary protected status, which is a status that is given to countries where it is not safe for those folks to live. And so they're given temporary status, they're allowed to come here, they're allowed to work, and their status is periodically evaluated, and what they do is they evaluate the conditions in their country to see whether or not it's safe to return. If it's not, they're allowed to stay. If it is, then they go back. DHS, over the last year, has made termination decisions for TPS across the board. So every time a country comes up for renewal, DHS does not renew that TPS status. So that's happened with Somalia, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Syria, Burma, Haiti, and Yemen. And as they come, it seems to be that the policy is as TPS comes up for renewal, that the administration should just not renew them. And the reason that there are still folks here under TPS is because the courts have stopped their removal orders. Move forward. One of the things that has happened over the last couple of years is, and this, by the way, has been a problem that's gone on. It's not just with this administration. This has been one of the immigration processes for a long time. One of the things that's important to say is a lot of the issues we've seen in terms of the way immigrants have been handled is not unique to this administration. And sometimes we like to paint it, certain people like to paint it in that direction, that it's only the Trump administration that has been treating immigrants in a way that we would not find acceptable. This goes way back, okay? Certainly this administration has put a lot of this stuff, I don't know how to say this, on steroids. But these kind of problems do have a long history. Reunification of children left behind has become difficult, and even though it is DHS's policy to reunite children with their parents, if there is a reason to separate children from a family, DHS's policy is to reunite children and families as soon as, quote, it's operationally feasible. There should be no removal of a parent without confirming the child's location and safety. But that's not the reality on the ground. We have seen parents deported without confirming where their children are. Children have been left in shelters or in foster care. Parents have been deported, or parents have been separated and they have not been able to contact their children for weeks and even months. Children have been classified as unaccompanied, even though DHS knew they had at least one parent that they could contact. Children have been released to sponsors while parents remain detained, and permission of the parents has not been sought, even though that is DHS's rule. So there are a lot of issues with how children are treated in this process. And I can't imagine what it's like to be 9 years old and be separated from my parents and then I haven't talked to them. I don't know where they are. I don't know where I am. I'm with a stranger. And this is what we're facing. So this is really important in terms of understanding how deportation policy has changed in the United States, because this is what's driving so much of the activity. Prior to 2016, DHS and ICE operated with formal enforcement priorities that focused immigration enforcement on three main groups. One, recent border crossings. The idea was if you crossed, say, between ports of entry, and you didn't have a valid claim, you were detained, you were processed quickly, and so that you could be sent back to your country before you established a life here, right? That seems to be the most humane thing to do. Individuals with serious criminal convictions, which I don't think there's anybody who would say that we want folks with serious criminal convictions being allowed into the United States. And if they were threats to national security. So that was the focus. That changed after 2016. ICE agents, after 2016, certainly in this term of this administration, they were directed not to prioritize. Look, wait a minute, let me jump back. I'm not reading this correctly. ICE agents, back under the previous rule, were directed not to prioritize most undocumented immigrants who, one, had lived in the U.S. for many years. They've been here 15 years, they've established a life. For whatever reason, we allowed them to stay. They're here. So now we have to figure out what to do with them in a humane way, and that's why they keep going back to court, and they keep getting, people say, well, why have they been here for 20 years, and they keep going to court, and they're not getting legal status, they have to come back. It's because there's no legal pathway for them, but they're here, and they have families and children, and we don't want to deport them, right? So when you hear about people who have been going to court for years and years and years, and you wonder, why is this happening? It's because the system is dysfunctional, and you can't make a proper determination legally. And so they're in this loop, right, that they can't get out of. ICE agents were directed not to prioritize those who had U.S. citizen children, because again, we don't want to separate these children. They had no criminal record. They were deeply integrated into their communities. As I mentioned earlier, some of these folks owned businesses and they had employees. They were working, paying taxes, or they had pending immigration cases. So DHS and ICE were focused on those who had just come across the border and those who were security threats or had criminal convictions. That has changed. We have now moved to large-scale interior enforcement and deportation operations. We narrowed or terminated humanitarian programs like parole, humanitarian parole, TPS, asylum pathways, restricting legal immigration like family-based immigration. That, there are certainly, when you're here as a legal immigrant, you have the opportunity to bring your family with you later. The current administration has slowed that down. And in fact, I think it's Latin American countries where they have stopped that altogether. And some of those countries are countries where, say, a father came up here, was able to bring one of their children. They have a valid asylum claim, and mom is left back with 2 children. They're still under threat. They need to come to the United States. That family-based immigration process for some countries has been stopped. And so they're stuck on both sides of the border in one way or another. So restricting legal immigration, family-based, employment-based, and refugee admissions have gone way down. So refugee admissions in fiscal year 2024 was 100,000 refugees admitted. In 2026, it was 7,500. Think about that drop, 7,500. The president raised it additional 10,000 to accommodate the Afrikaners from South Africa. That he said to come over because he claims they're under threat. So there are a lot of ways that now, we've restricted legal immigration. Now let me say this, and fair to be balanced on this. There's a lot of folks who say that over the generations, over the decades, immigration policy has gotten lax in many ways. And so it needs to be revisited and tightened up. There's a fair argument to make for that, right? And so don't dismiss somebody when they say, if you're just really pro-immigration, don't dismiss somebody when they say, we need to tighten things up a bit, because there's a logical case to be made for that. But there's a difference between tightening up things up and making the immigration system even more unworkable than it already is. And so what we see is an effort to not only deport people, but to also severely restrict the number of immigrants that can come into the country. By the way, we need them to come in. And we can talk about that later if you want, and why we need them. Okay, rollback of humanitarian programs. We've already talked about that. I do want to talk about Haiti very quickly. Haiti's been in the news. I've been out in Springfield a couple of times. I know some Haitians out there. I know a Haitian pastor I just can't imagine him being deported. Haiti is not safe to go back to. Even the State Department says it's not safe for Americans to go there. The airport is non-functional. It doesn't work. You can't fly into Haiti now without being shot at by gangs who, by the way, who have the weapons of a small army. They are really armed with automatic weapons, rocket launchers, you name it, they have it. And so these gangs are ruling Haiti. This man's brother is a pastor in Haiti, and his brother has told him, do not come back here. You're not safe to come back here. One of the things that could happen to someone like him is that if he goes back to Haiti now after being in the United States for several years, that he could be targeted because the assumption is he's come from America, he has money. And so he or his family could be targeted for such things as kidnapping, right? So it's severely not safe for him to go back there. With TPS being eliminated now, and the Supreme Court upholding the right of the administration to end TPS, if these folks go back, they will not be safe. The State Department tells Americans, do not go to Haiti. Do not go to Haiti. It tells its own State Department employees in Haiti, don't travel to the office, work from home. Don't travel to the office unless it's absolutely necessary. So it's hard to imagine why we would think it's safe for Haitians to go back. When our own State Department employees, who by the way, who do have protection, it's not safe for them to travel around. And I'm going to mention Haiti before we're done. So this is just more, I don't want to belabor the point too much here. The current administration is limiting every major immigration program through a combination of charging more fees so people can't afford it, restricting benefits, terminations of programs, processing slowdowns, expanded enforcement rules. And again, there are some things within the immigration system that we need to look at and they need to be tightened up, and that's a valid argument. okay? But is that what's going on now? It doesn't seem to be the case. Okay, let's talk a little bit about ICE. So ICE is currently, we all read about deportations. We're reading about the killings over the last couple of weeks. The man in Houston, the man in Maine, who have been shot by ICE agents. One of the criticisms of ICE, and it's a valid criticism, is that they've really reduced training. They've cut it way back. They've cut back how to vet folks to see whether or not they should be agents. We all expect our law enforcement entities, regardless of whether they're federal, local, state, we expect our law enforcement agencies to make sure that the people that they give a badge and give all this power to are people who should hold that kind of responsibility. That's a fair expectation for all Americans. Because the administration has such lofty goals in terms of immigration enforcement, they have really reduced all of that. In fact, the administration has criticized ICE's vetting and training and said they say it's too slow, it's too restrictive, it's too focused on compliance, and arguing that it hindered large-scale enforcement. And so the criticism of this is that there's an increased risk of violations to civil rights, child safety, and due process. And I don't have to litigate all of what we've seen that would say to us that that is true, right? In fact, in the recent killings, I was reading about this yesterday, it has come out that there are a lot of ICE officials who are in leadership responsibilities who are criticizing the United States' quota policy because they're saying it's making everybody unsafe. These are the ICE, this is the leadership of ICE that is saying, this is making everybody unsafe. That we have to arrest and detain. We have to detain 3,000 people a day. And so they're out looking for people, and they're detaining people who are here legally, people who are undocumented, but people, they've even detained citizens, and it's because they're trying to meet those quotas. And I think it doesn't take much thought to realize that these kinds of quotas for law enforcement, this is not the way law enforcement should be operating, right? 3,000 arrests per day, 1 million deportations per year, 99 detention beds filled daily. That's what they want, 99,000. 400,000 annual arrests and 500,000 criminal removals. These quotas are driving expanded enforcement operations, increased use of local jails, and broader detention authority, including for some lawful refugees. There are places where local law enforcement is complaining that they have too many people in their jails with supposed immigration infractions, that they don't have enough to house local criminals. One more thing, and I want to talk a little bit about how we should process all this as Christians. Detention centers. These are the complaints that, and I think we've read about this, but I do, and I was going to say, I won't mention this because everybody's heard this, but it has to be mentioned. That there are a lot of reports that detention centers have a lot of beatings, excessive force, life-threatening medical neglect, overcrowded, unsafe conditions, barriers to legal counsel, coercive deportation practices, deaths in custody and destroyed evidence, and lack of inspections of oversight failures. These things are happening in the detention centers. There's enough reporting, enough documentation of this. I could go through more of the details if we had time, but I do want to have some time for discussion. I'm going to give you my email address. If you'd like more of the details on this, email me. I'll be happy to send it all to you. So, what do? How do we advocate? What kind of tools? What kind of action should we take? What kind of resources should we have? So I always like to put this up when I talk about advocacy. How do we get to advocacy? Whether it's advocacy for immigrants, whether it's advocacy for the unborn, whether it's advocacy for those in poverty, how do we get people to the point where they advocate? Because there's a point in which we're all apathetic, and apathy doesn't come from any moral flaw. It comes from the fact that we have busy lives. and we're doing things, and we're focused on other things, and sometimes these issues just don't cross our mind because it's just not where we live, and there's nothing wrong with that. There was a time when I didn't think about immigration, right? So, we all are at a point where we can be apathetic. But at some point when we're made aware and we start to see what's really going on, then we ask ourselves, what do I do? How do I act? And how do I advocate? And that's the kind of thing that in what I do, I hope that we can get there. So the NAE, if you look at our website, you'll find all kinds of resources for advocacy on the website, nae.org. For example, we publish statements. We published a recent statement about immigration policy that will separate more families, that we want to encourage Christians who are part of the NAE to understand what's going on and advocate. We've asked the Trump administration to reverse decisions forcing immigrants to process visas abroad. If you don't know what that is, the Trump administration has come up with a new rule that says that if you apply for a green card, you cannot remain in the United States. You have to go back to your home country and wait for your green card to be approved, which means more family separations, right? Because the law says that you can apply for a green card here and you can wait until you get notified on the decision before you have to leave if your green card is rejected. People have families and children. Congress passed this law, I want to say 1958, I think, maybe it was 1952, because they saw the problem of people who wanted permanent status and already had families, right? That was actually the beginning of the modern green card process. We spoke up, celebrating the Congress's view of birthright citizenship, because again, this was going to cause families to separate, and it was going to create a second-tier class of citizens. And so we celebrated that. If you do want to advocate for us, if you want to learn more about what we talk about, because immigration is not the only issue we advocate for, you can go to nae.org/takeaction. Obviously, you can call your representatives or you can contact representatives through us. I do take pastors and other Christian leaders to in-district office meetings to meet with Congress people and their staff to talk about these issues. If that's something they're interested in doing, you can always email me and say, hey, next time you go to see my representative so-and-so, next time you go see her, I'd like to go with you. And I'll put you on the list for that. We do a lot of proximity events where we take churches and church groups into situations where they can see what immigrants face. I take groups of pastors and church leaders to Cleveland, and we take a day and we go to several different places and we meet with an immigrant pastor, and we meet with asylum seekers and refugees, and we meet with those people of Christian faith who work with those folks to help them get established legally, so people can see what is going on. The last time I did one of those, someone said to me, I had no idea that the immigrant community was so vital. I had no idea. And it helped them to see that. So, one of the things I would encourage you to do, our newest campaign, it just actually came up on our website this morning. Protect our Haitian neighbors. TPS has been revoked by the Trump administration for Haitians. The Haitians are facing deportation. Their work permits are set to expire on July 24th, which means at that point, Haitians under TPS will no longer be allowed to work in the United States. They've been here for years, they have families, they have children, and so we would like to see their status to be continued, because again, Haiti is not safe to go back to. There's no account by which you can make a case that Haiti is safe to go back to. But the Senate must act by July 24th. The House has actually already passed a bill that would allow Haitians to stay until 2029. But it has to be passed in the House, and it has to be passed by July 24th. So if you go to nae.org, take action, you will see the list of issues that we are asking people to respond to. And one at the top of the list right now is protect our Haitian neighbors. And you can add your name and you can write a letter to your senators and say, we want you to pass this. And we're hoping to get a lot of traction out of this to get the Senate to pay attention. And you know, in fairness to our politicians, they're dealing with a lot of issues and a lot of bills and a lot of politics. And so for them to hear clearly from their constituents, I want you to do this. It's important. If you'd like to sign up for our Policy Matters newsletter, which goes out every month and it deals with different issues, immigration, freedom of religion, global health, there are all kinds of issues that we address in there. If you go to Policy Matters on the website, you can sign up for that as well. Okay, let me say just a couple of things about the biblical story. The biblical story is one of migration, and we all have a migration story. We don't often think of the biblical story as a story of migration, particularly if we live in a place where we have been established, because that's just not our perception of life. It is the perception of life of immigrants. People who are migrants interpret the Bible. They read the Bible differently because they identify with the migrants that we find in the Bible. But you can't go very far in the Bible before you have migration stories, right? Abraham, who has to go to Egypt because there's a famine, right? And then Joseph, and then Moses. I mean, all of this connection between Egypt, which at that time was a land of plenty, and people going there because they needed to eat. And what the Bible is a story. One of the ways we can see the Bible is a story of the migrant people of God who recognize God in their history and his provision for them as they travel. And that becomes very important for the New Testament. What is one of the first stories we read in the Gospels? Mary and Joseph taking Jesus to where? Egypt, to flee the political violence that Herod wants to inflict on him. When we read the story of the Exodus and the people of Israel leaving Exodus, we should not think that every single Israelite left Egypt, because like all immigrant communities, when they go into a new land, they all end up in various places. And so the idea that there were Israelites who were in a maybe a better place than this community of Israelites, the main community of Israel, then they didn't leave. Maybe they had married Egyptians. Who knows what the story is? But that community of Israelites was in Egypt for generations and generations. And so when Mary and Joseph need to flee with Jesus, they go to the logical place. They flee where they have a people to go to. And that's what immigrants do. How many immigrants go to a place where they have family, where they have friends? Because they need to go to a place where they know they will be welcome. That's our biblical story. And Paul uses that in the New Testament to talk about what it means to be incorporated into the house of Israel as people in Christ. For you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but you are now part of the household of God. So that image of migration just permeates our understanding of what it means to be the people of God. And too often for those of us who are established, and we don't think in terms of migration, when we interpret the scripture when it comes to this issue, we interpret the scripture through a lens that focuses on our own protection in the land that we reside in, rather than the needs of those who come here. And we need to kind of change that. You know the word hospitality really means? It really means love of the foreigner. If you look at the word hospitality in the Greek, we like to think of hospitality as, my Aunt Edna who knows how to throw a dinner party, right? And great for Aunt Edna who does that. But the gift of hospitality in the scripture is the person who knows how to love the stranger. And the Bible tells us that strangers are next to the heart of God. And so when we think of how we need to engage with immigration, I think that's where we start as Christians. People who know that these are people who need to be loved. We all know the story of Hagar, who had to flee Sarah because Sarah was going to do violence to her. And Sarah was the slave woman with the child. She had no rights. She only had the good graces of Abraham and Sarah. And when that ended, she was in peril. And she had to flee. And God, what did God do? He saw her. And he took care of her. And Hagar is the only person in the Bible that gives God a name. She calls him El Roy, which means the God who sees me, right? The God who sees me. And so, can we look at immigrants in all of their circumstances and say, these are people that God sees? Can we see them? And how do we make others see them as well? Okay. I'm done. I always go longer than what I say I'm going to go. That is my email. If you want to take a picture of that or write it down. I like to go to churches and talk to churches. Sunday mornings, I talk to anyone who wants to listen about issues of immigration. One of the things we're doing at NAE now is we're trying to have difficult conversations on this issue. And to invite people who think differently on this. It's okay for Christians to think differently on this issue. But can we have constructive conversations about this, right? So I'm always willing to do any of that. Again, send me an email. I'd be happy to come. Okay, we do have a couple minutes for questions, if I can take a couple. Any questions, comments, impressions?
National immigration table, how is it related?
The evangelical immigration table?
Evangelical.
Yeah, we're a part of it. Yep. And thank you for bringing that up. If you want to go to a place that has a lot of great resources on immigration, look up the evangelical immigration table. They have a lot of excellent resources. If you want to dig more deeply into specifically the refugee issue, go to World Relief's website.
I appreciate you having that. You're walking a tightrope, obviously, in the political climate, and you're trying to have a balanced view and presentation. I noticed you had at the top of the list the rule of law. Yeah. I could say a lot more about that, but what about the rule of compassion?
Yeah.
And what we have the right to control our borders. Are they our borders, or do we have the right to love our neighbor? For the Christian, it's a different paradigm.
It is.
If we're looking at people around the world and the need around the world, and you alluded to that. I appreciate that.
I often say to people, and sometimes I get mixed reactions to this phrase. I will say, if I look at the scripture and how the scripture talks about strangers and immigrants and what God says about how they're supposed to be treated, I think to myself, if we really took that seriously, when immigrants showed up at our door, we wouldn't ask them, what are you doing here? We would say, welcome, we've been expecting you. And of course I get mixed reactions to that, and that's okay. I do say it in a sense with some shock value and to cause some discussion. But the church offers a third way. I think one of the things we do by mistake, and I don't care if you vote Democrat, Republican, how you see yourself politically, we do ourselves a mistake when we don't understand that what the Christian church offers the world is a different way.
Yes.
It's a different way. And it's not beholden to our political allegiances. And if we don't work hard to do that, the result is going to be that we're not going to be salt and light. Right? So, and that's why we have to have meaningful discussions and be able to respectfully disagree and see a way forward. Because I will tell you, I think society, we're evangelicals. We think that we have a message society needs, right?
an interesting comment on the rule of law. I was with a group of Hispanic pastors in Houston. This is probably 15 years ago. They had a number of us presenting on different themes regarding immigration and our Christian position towards it. There were 2 out of the 7 that made any allusion to the law and obedience to the law. And they were 2 gringos, me and another guy. And the rest of them, it was kind of outside the parameters. And when I dug down to try and find out what was going on, I think our American view of obedience to governing authorities comes down to an abstract concept of law.
It does.
And internationally, that's not necessarily the case, and it probably wasn't the case when Paul spoke those words.
Well, think about what do we see in the Old Testament prophets, and what does Jesus, when Jesus is criticizing the Pharisees, and what's he say? He says, you've neglected the more weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy. And you see that pattern in the prophets, justice and mercy. And so when you talk about the rule of law, justice and mercy. Justice without mercy is oppression. Mercy without justice is sentimentality. And so we hold those 2 together, right? And so do people need to come here legally? Yeah, I will concede that. But you need to mercifully have a legal process that they can navigate, that makes sense. Because I can tell you that they come here, immigrants come here, and I'm sure you know this, they get stuck in this loop and they cannot get out of it. And I got a call from a Latino pastor up in well, I don't say what, who called me and said, can you talk to this woman? Her father is going to be deported, and he spent thousands of dollars on this immigration attorney who promised him that this immigration attorney would get him here legally. And it was a scam, which by the way happens all the time. There are so many people out there who promise legal services to immigrants, but they're just taking their money. And so he had spent everything he had, and now he's going to be detained and deported. And they said, can you help him? Well, I don't have the ability to help him. So I ended up connecting him with an attorney who would do a free consultation with him. And when I talked to the attorney afterwards, she said to me, Matt, I hate to tell you this, but we looked over everything. There's nothing we can do for you. So those are the kind of things that are happening. Justice. And that's not only not merciful, that's not just. There's no justice in that whatsoever.
Well, I mean, even if you have an attorney representation right now anyway, it doesn't seem to matter.
You are correct.
We've had people that they do the asylum claims, they go through the process and said, that's a really good claim. You're from Venezuela, how about we send you to Ecuador?
Yeah, well that's the other thing, and I didn't mention it because I ran out of time. And you've heard about the third country removals, where they take someone from one country and send them to a country that they've never been to. They don't speak the language, they don't know anybody. Or they sent them to this horrible prison down in El Salvador, right? But you are correct. Right now, immigration attorneys are struggling because what this administration has done is, because the immigration law in our country is so broken, that they can take it, they can really take advantage of that brokenness. And that's Congress's fault. That's Congress's fault. And by the way, Congress does listen to, of the groups that they listen to when it comes to religious groups, they really do take evangelicals seriously. It's probably the one religious group they will pay attention to the most.
So trying to get or encourage our church, people within our church, to move from apathy to awareness. What is practically, how do we do that?
Great question. So I like to say that we don't change people's hearts and minds by the brilliance of our arguments. We change people's hearts and minds by changing their experience. And so if we bring them into proximity with people and they hear their stories, that does more to change minds. And that's why I said we do proximity events. That I will bring people into proximity to immigrants and let them tell you their story. Because that does more than anything I can ever say, right? And so if you're interested in doing that, let's have a conversation and see how we could arrange something that we could do that. Tell you a quick story in relation to that. Know a pastor and his wife, the two of them, I call them co-pastors because even though he was the pastor, they were co-pastors. And he had the charismatic personality of the preacher, and she had the administrative skills to keep him on track, right? So they were a great team. And when I was at the seminary, I was her advisor for her doctoral program. And one of the things she did was she wanted to bring immigrants and non-immigrants together. And so she actually hosted this neighborhood dinner. She lived in it was a high immigrant population. And she brought these folks together. She asked them all to bring, here's an idea for your church. She asked them all to bring a dish from their heritage. And to bring that dish for people to share. And she prepared them and said, I'm going to ask you why this dish is important to you. We all have those dishes in our family, right? I can tell you that one of the reasons that blackberry pie is my favorite kind of pie was because whenever my grandfather went out behind his house in the woods and picked blackberries, my grandmother would make me a blackberry pie. And I can still think about walking into her house and smelling that pie bacon. And to this day, I cannot turn down a piece of blackberry pie. It just doesn't happen. So she invited all these people together to tell this, to share these and tell what it was about this dish that was so important to them. And then she asked people to kind of share their stories. And this one man from Guatemala, who was an undocumented immigrant, talked about how he ended up in Ohio, that he and his family owned a banana farm. I want to say Honduras or Guatemala, I don't remember. And that the government came and took their land. And the government then started selling bananas to American companies. But they allowed the family to stay on the farm and work it. And they worked it for almost nothing. And so they couldn't do it anymore. They said, we can't survive like this. So they came to the United States. And there was one woman at the dinner who was very anti-immigrant. And when she talked with the host afterwards, she had tears coming down her face. And she said, I had no idea. I had no idea. When you bring people into proximity with folks and they get to hear their story. I mean, isn't that the problem with some of the Pharisees, is they refuse to listen to people's stories, and Jesus is listening to all the stories, right? He knows that he is the story. So, yeah, we can talk if you want to do anything like that. I think we're over time. You're welcome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.